I'm going to talk about, I guess, change management in the brain. This is about the future of work today. And, we're in Philadelphia, and so, I'm from the University of Pennsylvania, so we always have to start out with our founder, who's Ben Franklin, who said there's nothing that is certain except death and taxes, but he hadn't seen anything yet, because I think if there's anything that's certain anymore, it's the uncertainty, and it's the fact that things are constantly changing. And we know that in the workplace, change is often associated with stress, right? It's just really difficult, especially when your organization and you as an individual, you've been trained for a certain job, and suddenly, the rug's pulled out from under you. Your company's been acquired by a larger company, and suddenly you have to do things differently. And a recent survey, this is in 2017, I think, from the American Psychological Association, asked thousands of people who were undergoing change. And the findings were pretty provocative, which is that people who had experienced recent or current change in the workplace, this is leading to chronic work stress, this was leading to physical symptoms, negative attitude, they're smoking, they're drinking, it's interfering with their personal life. I mean, this just sounds like a disaster, right? And I don't know how many people here have had to deal with that or had to potentially help coach organizations through this kind of change. It's really, really challenging. And when we think about change management, there are a lot of components that go into it in terms of developing the motivation to do it, getting everybody on board, developing a strategy for navigating through the change that you have to manage. What I'm going to focus on here, and it's not surprising, is the teamwork component. So how do you basically get people on board? How do you make them care about each other, care about the firm and the organization in a way that allows them to move through this in as stress-free a way and in a cooperative way as possible? And I think in terms of businesses, where do you look to get insights? And so you can look at leaders who have successfully helped their organizations navigate major change. I think there's a lot of looking toward places like the military, where elite teams have had to deal with intense stress, and those individuals are often a very great source of guidance for this kind of ordeal. I think we look a lot to sports, where there's a lot of dynamism, right? A lot of change. If you're in Philadelphia, if you're a Philadelphia native, if you've had to withstand the process, trust the process, right? That's been a long-going, slow-burning change that hasn't quite resolved itself yet. Some coaches seem to be really good at this, like Bill Belichick. We'll see whether the 76ers can weather that storm. Well, today I'm going to draw inspiration, and hopefully you will too, draw some insights from a very unlikely source, which is these critters. So surprisingly, for a person who spends half his time in business school, I spend about half my time studying these animals, rhesus macaques. We study them in the lab, but we also study them in the wild. And rhesus macaques are a really interesting animal to study because for two reasons, basically. One is that their biology is almost identical to our own. So they share about 98% of their DNA with us. Their brains are organized in essentially the same way as ours. Okay, they have all the same brain areas wired up more or less the same way. And their behavior is very, very similar to ours as well. So they live in large groups. And the most important characteristics of those groups is that monkeys form friendships with each other. They form essentially teams. They work hard to maintain those relationships with each other. And the better that team, the better the relationships amongst those individuals, the better those animals do, and the more likely they are to weather a storm. And this is a place where we do a lot of our work. It's quite beautiful. It's called Cayo Santiago Island. It's off the east coast of Puerto Rico. It's a very inviting place to go during the winter months here in Philadelphia. So if any of you is interested in doing a little citizen science, we'd love to have you on board. And the monkeys there live basically very natural, normal lives. There's anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 monkeys there at any one time. They're descended from a a founding population of 400 who were brought there from India in 1938 as a research population. And as I said before, monkeys on this island, just like monkeys in India where they're from, form these very strong connections with each other, sort of a web of social relationships. And that's what we're mapping out here is for one group in 1 year on the island. So all the squares are females, the circles are males. And the lines that are connecting them means that they have spent a lot of time servicing their social relationship, basically grooming each other. It's like you going out and having coffee or a beer and talking with your friend, calling them on the phone. That's what those lines are. And so this is sort of like Facebook for monkeys, okay? And the monkeys who are in the center have the most friends. They have the deepest, densest connections with others, and monkeys who are on the outskirts out here have only one or maybe, just a couple of connections. And there are some monkeys who really don't have any friends. They don't interact with anybody. They're pretty much loners. They're aloof. And what we've discovered in this population is that monkeys who have more friends, monkeys who have more connections, actually do better in life. They're happier, they're healthier, they have more offspring, so they're more successful. And the monkeys who are on the outskirts don't. And this is exactly what you see in people as well. So people who have deeper or more numerous social connections live longer, happier, healthier lives, and they also make more money. And we have been focusing in the last few years, both in the lab and in the field, on parts of the brain, something known as the social brain network, that is a specialized system in each of our heads. Each of you is carrying this around with you. It's part of your toolkit. And its job is to manage your relationships with others, to manage your connections with others. And it basically starts at the back of your head. I know I keep getting in front of that speaker. It starts at the back of your head, and it kind of decodes who's around you, what's their emotional state, where are they looking, what are they paying attention to, and then that kind of flows forward into two really important brain areas, one that's involved in empathy, or resonating with the emotional experience of another individual, and the other is something we call theory of mind, or mentalizing, and that's kind of a more cognitive process that means developing a model and understanding what another individual wants, believes, desires, knows. Okay, so it's their knowledge, and then from that, those kind of two streams coming together, that shapes how we interact with another individual. Do we cooperate with them? Do we help them with them if they're in need? Do we cheat them? Right? Those kinds of things. It's all determined by that network. And what we found is that in these monkeys living on this island, two critical parts of their brains, in this case, this part up here in the front of the brain, which is critically involved in empathy in humans, and also seems to play the same function in monkeys, sort of the same function in monkeys. It's systematically bigger in monkeys who have more friends, who have managed to make more connections, okay? Suggesting there's a very strong relationship between the structure and function of this area and your success in navigating the social world. And we also see that in this other part of the brain, which is right about here, that is involved in this other process I told you about, sort of theory of mind, understanding what another individual might be thinking about, desiring what they know, et cetera. And those two sets of processes come together to enable a monkey to decide what to do next. Okay? And they're going to manage their connections with all the other monkeys around. Now, talk about organizational change. Okay, so we've been happily studying this population for 10 years, gathering data on thousands of monkeys, DNA data, brain data, et cetera. And then in 2017, in September 2017, Hurricane Maria, which was a Category 5 cyclone, struck Puerto Rico, as you all know, but it hit the island of Cayo Santiago first. The eye wall of the storm went right over Cayo before it hit the mainland of Puerto Rico, packing over 200-mile-an-hour winds. And it was devastating. So we actually didn't know whether our field assistants or our monkeys survived the storm, so we hired a helicopter pilot to fly over the island 2 days later, and this is what he saw. Basically, it looks like a bomb went off. All the plants are more or less destroyed. The trees are destroyed. All of our research facilities were destroyed. So this was like incredibly devastating. Miraculously, all the monkeys survived the storm, just like the people of Puerto Rico. Most people survived the storm, but after the storm, they began dying at very high rates. So this is mortality. So this is deaths per 100 adults up until the storm here in red, and now we see that there's just this incredible explosion in monkeys dying, and they're dying because of stress. Okay? They're not dying because they got washed away by the storm, but because of the physical difficulties of getting around on the island. There's difficulty getting food, difficulty getting water, and as more monkeys are dying, those are their social partners who are dying as well, and so this is an incredible source of stress for these animals. But we continued to, our amazing research team continued to follow these animals, okay, within days of the storm hitting, and they recording their behavior. And what's plotted here, and this is for about 4 months after the storm, but we've continued to collect data for 3 groups of monkeys after the storm. And in the 2 smaller groups of monkeys, this is that Facebook for Monkeys social network. This is the connections between monkeys. What's being plotted here is how dense that network is, which is a measure of how social they are, how much time they're spending with each other and interacting. And we see that it's systematically going up, and it stayed up all the way across the 2 years since we were there. And the other feature we see, and you can't really read this here, is something we borrowed from economics called the Gini index. And so this is measuring the equality of those social relationships. So what's happening is the monkeys are becoming more social, more tolerant, and they're becoming more egalitarian in the way they interact with each other. So they're no longer cliquish, okay, and staying within their prior, little groups and networks, but they're reaching out across networks. And higher-ranking monkeys are now interacting with lower-ranking monkeys in a way that they did not before. Boy, that sounds really wonderful, doesn't it? Now, we see that kind of thing in people, right, immediately after tornadoes, hurricanes, 9/11, right? But it doesn't seem to last, right? After 9/11, I think the reports were that you saw this sort of increase in tolerance and pro-social behavior lasted for about 3 months, and then it kind of went away. What's really remarkable is we know from laboratory work that when monkeys become more social like that, okay, when they have more intense and deeper connections with a larger group of monkeys, their brains actually change. Okay, so this is from work from a study done by colleagues of mine at Oxford, collaborators, and they took monkeys who were living alone, and they put them into different sized groups, and basically they gave them a larger, richer set of social network connections. And then after a few months, they scanned their brains, and they looked at these brain areas that we've looked at on the island of Cabo Santiago. And what they found is that the monkeys who had to use these brain networks more, right, to manage deeper connections with more other individuals, those parts of the brain grew. And the connections between these areas grew. Okay, so it tells us that it's not just kind of what you're born with. It tells you that if you use it, you can grow it, right? It's like a muscle. And if you respond to, or in anticipation of major change and major stress, if you actually engage with other individuals the way these monkeys are doing, you're likely to grow your own brain's capacity to manage connections with others. And we know that when you do that, that confers a better ability to understand other individuals. Okay, so let's get back to stress and managing change. As I was mentioning, we have this exact same social brain network in our heads that monkeys do. And in general, the more friends you have, the deeper your connections, the bigger and healthier this network is. Okay, so even on Facebook, it turns out. So the more Facebook, this is actually work that was done before bots and everything on Facebook, but essentially, even the more virtual connections you have, the bigger your social brain network is. And it's really interesting, again, to think about the work that AIIR does and put it in the context of management. And really beautiful set of ongoing studies, that, which a preliminary report came out of Google Project Oxygen a couple of years ago. Adam Grant has worked on this, showing that if you ask people in the organization what makes a great manager, what makes a good team, and you do frequency analysis, statistics on the words that are returned, it's basically high emotional intelligence, right? So high EQ, a good communicator, right? One who takes time to try to understand you and to work with you, and not somebody who's very hierarchical, somebody who's a good coder or a good engineer, which is essentially what Google was promoting to management during that time. And so I want to leave you with a few thoughts about the ways in which we know from neuroscience, and this will, I think, tee up the panel discussion, from neuroscience, some of the ways that we can enhance our connections with others to be a good manager, to be a good coach, especially in anticipation of major change and working our way through those changes. The first is paying attention, right? Looking people in the eye, paying attention to what they do. If you're not actually paying attention to the people around you, the people that you need to work with, the people that you need to coach and help, nothing's going to happen. And the benefit, an added benefit of that, not only do you get data into your social brain network, when you make positive eye contact with people, this releases oxytocin into your brain. And you can think of that as a volume knob that's turning up the processing of that social brain network. Okay, so that it is processing, it's doing everything it does, but more. Okay? Okay, the second is to flatten the hierarchy. Okay, I'm sure you talk about that a lot. There's a number of studies now that show that both people and monkeys who believe themselves to be very high-ranking or who are high-ranking tend not to pay very much attention to others, okay? And for that reason, they don't get as rich data about those individuals. They learn less about them. They form a less sophisticated model of their internal states. And this also turns down activity in their social brain networks as well. So there's been several studies now showing that activity within the social brain network, right, which is what is needed to manage your relationships with others, it's lower in people who think that they're higher ranking than others, higher status than others. Okay, so I think flattening the hierarchy is a very good thing to do. Zab and I have a lot of experience with that from our prior gig at Duke, where we had a lot of sort of jockeying for relative status, and we eventually instituted a completely flat hierarchy, and everybody was happier and we were able to get the job done. The other thing, I think, another really important thing to do is to focus on team instead of tribe or identity, right? And this is critical for cooperation, and I think some of you may have seen some of these videos before. If you saw my talk, was that last year, up in New York with AIIR. But work done by one of the postdocs in Wharton Neuroscience Initiative before he came to us. So he had been doing his graduate work in Beijing and also at UC Berkeley. And he was very interested in the relationship between empathy and ethnic identity and sort of unconscious bias. Okay, and we all have, we all go through the trainings where we're taught to, be aware of your bias, and it's sort of that's enough, that's good enough to kind of overcome it. It's not really enough. Okay, so he developed these videos, which are a little bit striking. I'm just going to show them to you. So here's one, and this is an empathetic group, so you guys, I heard a little bit from you, that's great. Here's another one. Okay, so first of all, nobody's hurt making the videos. These are fake needles that go up into the syringe. And there's another set of videos where they actually evince, they show their pain that they're in. You also notice that there's two different ethnicities represented here. So there's Caucasian and Chinese. And Feng did these studies in both China and in the US, and he measured brain responses to these videos using both functional brain imaging as well as EEG, which is measuring brain waves on the surface of the head. And there's a very characteristic set of brain areas that are engaged when we feel pain for others, as I mentioned before. Okay, and what he found, and this is really remarkable, is that in Chinese observers, when they are watching a Chinese woman's face apparently pierced with a needle, there's a nice quote-unquote brain empathy response. Watching a Caucasian woman's face pierced with a needle, there's much less. And you see the opposite in a Caucasian observer who's showing a brain empathy response to somebody who's from her ethnic group, but not to somebody from a different ethnic group, right? And so this is quite striking, suggests this is sort of the neural correlate, if you will, of unconscious bias and sort of tending to pay attention more to people who are part of your tribe and who look more like you. And if you want later, we can talk about the fact this is not just a uniquely human phenomenon. We see this in animals as well, okay? Now, it's not all doom and gloom, and I say focus on team over tribe because there are things that we can do, okay, that can sort of rescue that brain empathy response. So one of the things that I'm very aware of is that we do this strange thing every weekend here during football season. We all put on green jerseys and we go down to Lincoln Financial Field, and then we're willing to fight people who have blue jerseys or black jerseys or red jerseys for no good reason at all, other than that they have a different colored jersey on. And the people who are wearing green jerseys are different ethnicities, different socioeconomic status from different parts of the world. But there's one thing uniting them. They're all on the same team, right? And actually Fung replicated his experiment, but now he included a condition in which he said, and he literally had people in the videos either wearing a blue shirt or a red shirt and told the people who were watching them, you're on the blue team or the red team, and you're going to work together with people on your team after you watch these videos. Okay, so this is known as a minimal group manipulation in social psychology, done in the 1960s. And it shows you can pull people off the street and you say, you're on the blue team or you're on the red team, and the people on the red team say, I really hate those people on the blue team. They're ugly and they're jerks and And so remarkably, when you do this, if you see somebody who is now they're wearing this jersey that they're on your team, even if they're from a different ethnic group, now you see this brain empathy response is kind of rescued, okay? Suggesting that although we kind of come in with a set of defaults, default biases and assumptions about who we really connect with, that can be changed by what we consciously decide to focus on. If we focus on team over tribe, that's going to be good for everyone. I like to say that we can utilize some of this knowledge to begin to build empathy for your organization as well. And this is a little bit speculative, what I'm going to tell you about now. Because when you talk about building empathy and social connection, our capacity to do that evolved in situations where there were no organizations, where there were no companies, right? So it's a social thing. It's about building a connection to another person. But there's been a lot of ideas and theories in business, especially in marketing, that we apply and use sort of our internal hardware we use to relate to other people, to relate to firms, to companies, to brands. And that's something that we tested in the past year or so, and we have a paper that's under review on this right now. And in this case, what we're looking at is consumer brain responses to brands. Okay, so a brand stands for a company. Okay, so it's not a human being, it's a company. And in this case, we brought in people who are Apple iPhone users or Samsung Galaxy users. Okay. And we brought them to the lab. We had them go into a brain imaging machine, an MRI machine, and they were lying in there. And then we exposed them to messages about good or bad things happening to their brand or the other brand. So to a company, like, oh, Apple's profit soared, or Samsung had a problem with their battery, it exploded in a plane, everybody died. It wasn't quite like that dramatic. We asked people how they felt about it, and then we measured their brain responses as well, just like in the study I showed you with the needle stick. And what we found is really, really interesting, at least for our Apple customers who reported strong empathy for Apple. That's exactly what we see. So when they hear good news about Apple, we see activation in parts of the brain where you feel reward. Okay, it's sort of like empathy. And when they hear something bad happen to Apple as a company, they're showing a pattern of brain response that is as if their family member had experienced pain. Okay. And they showed nothing for Samsung. Now, the bad news for Samsung's chief marketing officer is that Samsung customers didn't show anything for Samsung. So they had failed to build a strong social and emotional connection with their customers. The only thing they did was build antipathy toward Apple. So Samsung customers just basically, they buy Samsung because they hate Apple. And they either can't afford Apple products, or they just don't like the idea of it because they're too much of a tribe, right? But I think this is pointing us down a pathway, and Apple's done this amazing thing over the last 10 years, I think, beginning with that I'm a Mac guy, I'm a PC guy, creating a personality and creating kind of a sense of personhood for the company and for the brand, and that has resulted in very strong sense of emotional and social connection between the customers and the brand. I think we can use this as a way of thinking about how we can do that for companies in general. How do we endow employees with the loyalty it will take to navigate through some kind of major change with the company and trust them? Okay. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about synchrony. This is one of my favorite topics. I was saying get in sync. What's being plotted here, this has become a cottage industry in neuroscience and social psychology. I'm plotting, actually, this is from the work of Talia Wheatley at Dartmouth, who came down and spoke at AIIR Summit last fall. And this is a map. This is sort of Facebook for MBA students at Dartmouth. These are the web of relationships amongst all the graduate students in the business program. So some of them have close friendships and some are more distant. And what she's found, which relates to things that have been found by others, is that people who are closer friends, right, really tight, they're really tight with each other, their brains actually tend to synchronize when they're watching the same movie. Okay, which means that their brains are kind of attending to and following and processing information that is coming in a very similar way. Right? They're seeing the world through the same eyes. Whereas people who are less close, right, who are not good friends, their brains do not see the world the same way. So if we can, I think the implication, this is existing friendships, but if we can achieve something like synchrony by boosting the connections between people, people will be more likely to see the world the same way, to buy into the plan for organizational change. And this is not, something that just happens in our brains, but it actually percolates down into our bodies. And this is something we've been working on at Wharton Neuroscience, especially in the context of sports. So sports teams need to have good chemistry in order to perform well, and the outcomes are easier for us to measure than they are in business. So that's one reason why sports is a great petri dish for doing this kind of work. So we worked with Penn Rowing, Penn Wrestling, we worked with a professional soccer team in the UK, and so we've monitored brain activity, and we've also measured cardiac activity, so heart rates and respiration rates, and it turns out when your brain is in sync, your heartbeats tend to become in sync as well, which is, in some cases in the laboratory, shown to be a good marker of cooperation and trust and teamwork, and we find that that's true in rowers, for example, and that just having rowers work next to each other, okay, boosts their synchrony. This is heart rate synchrony from, if you allow them to work separately, they're not in sync at all. When they're training next to each other, their heart rates come into greater synchrony that is almost the same level you get if you force them to actually row together. Okay, so working together, working side by side so you can see each other, hear each other, smell each other maybe, tends to boost synchrony, as I said before. This synchrony is associated with seeing the world in a very similar way and also cooperation. And we've extended these observations to more kind of business-like settings. For example, one here where we've brought in students who are told they're on a hiring committee, in this case, and they have to evaluate applicants for a job. And they're each given some information about the applicant, but nobody has complete information. And so the job is or the task really, and they don't know that, they have to discover that, is to share unique information early in the discussion. The earlier you share that information, the more likely you are to come to consensus and make the right decision. So you have to feel this sense of psychological safety. And what we find is that those committees where synchrony is higher tend to reach consensus and make the right decision compared to those groups where synchrony is lower. Now, that's an observation, and it's telling us that synchrony, physiological synchrony, is a biomarker for, in this case, group outcomes, but doesn't tell us how we can build that synchrony. And that's something we're working on now, and we'd be happy to talk about it in the panel, which are exercises that many of you probably engage in that are meant to boost connections, boost intimacy between people, but we want to understand the underlying biology. And I think these are our key takeaways, which is that organizational change is stressful, right? But strengthening social ties is an adaptive response to change, not just for people, but for animals as well. We've seen that in the monkeys responding to the hurricane in Puerto Rico. And there are a number of things that we can do that have the effect of boosting our connections with others by boosting activity within the social brain network, including eye contact, paying attention to each other, flattening our hierarchy, and emphasizing team over tribe. And together, right, if we can engage in these kinds of activities that promote forming friendships and connections amongst others, it seems to, and training together, this seems to boost physiological synchrony, allowing us to see through the eyes of others, and this gets us in sync, and the outcomes then can be better.